Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Elden Ring Nightreign on the RTX 5060. You can see the specs for our 5060 over here in GPU-Z. We're running an MSRP model, just the MSI Shadow 2X version of the card, just a simple, cheap $300 two-fan model. You can see GPU-Z has now finally been updated to actually accurately reflect all of the statistics and the specs for the card. And the main thing here, of course, is that measly 8 gigabytes of video memory, and maybe even worse, the pretty terrible 128-bit bus. Here you can see we're running the card on the latest NVIDIA drivers and just leaving the card at default and stock settings, no overclock applied. And here you can see we're pairing the card with a 9800 X3D and 64 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. This is just to ensure that we don't have any sort of bottleneck when it comes to our CPU. Let's hop in. Alright, we'll start here at 1080p and we're on the highest possible settings. So these are actually custom settings, maximum settings with everything turned up as high as they can go. The highest settings just don't have a maximum preset. And the only slight adjustment that I made is just turning off motion blur. And as you can see in our loading zone here, our little, I should figure out what this is called, round table hold, keep, something like that. You can see we're getting essentially perfect performance here. Pretty much, the game is locked at 60 FPS, so really that's what we're aiming for. We're not going to get higher than 60 FPS. The actual game engine will allow us to do that by default. So that is where we're actually going to be just kind of stuck. So here, this is basically perfect for what we're going to be looking at. Of course, this is obviously just our starting zone here. But the main thing that we're really going to be keeping an eye on is our video memory in particular. So we're not, anywhere near like worrying territory yet. You can see our GPU utilization and our CPU utilization are both, well within a manageable range. Our GPU is not being fully utilized whatsoever, only pulling, 40 watts in this scene. Elden Ring is not a demanding game, and the same holds true for Elden Ring Nightreign. They tend to be pretty well-performing games, given that you're only really looking for 60 FPS before you start thinking about mods. There are not yet any mods that do offer a FPS unlock. I did see one on Nexus Mods, but it was being flagged as having like potentially harmful stuff in it, so I'm not going to be testing that one out yet until there's a slightly more reputable mod out there, although there is stuff already to disable the anti-cheat, so it does seem likely that those mods will be coming down in the future. So let's hop in and see if our video memory and our FPS kind of hold strong as we're actually in a gameplay environment. I should mention I am going to be playing online just because I think most people who play this game are going to be playing online. So, of course, there is a bit of variance when it comes to the online play, when it comes to, networking and things like that. It could potentially cause some stutters and weird dips and things like that, just depending on your actual connection. So do keep that in mind. And I don't expect us to have to play too much at 1080p. I imagine the card is going to handle the game completely fine. The only real variable that I'm kind of interested to see, but I still don't think is really going to be a major issue, is our video memory. And flying into our zone here, you can see that we're essentially getting perfect performance here. There are slight stutters loading in our new environment, but right off the bat, doesn't really seem like there's any really cause for concern as far as our performance goes. Not super surprising. A 1% low is kind of low, around 49, lower than I saw on the B580 that I've already tested here. But again, some of that 1% low weirdness can be attributed to some potential networking issues, so we'll see if that actually becomes a real problem as we continue on here. But as expected, even at max settings, 1080p, it's not a demanding game and seems to be performing just about perfectly. Our GPU utilization is indicating that it's handling these scenes without really any issue whatsoever. But I do want to get to at least maybe a boss encounter just to ensure that maybe there's no, potential problems that we might encounter later on. Now, we did encounter this boss here, the Bell Bearing Hunter, which is actually our night boss, so a little too early here. But obviously you can see, not super crazy effects, but essentially, our GPU utilization is indicating that really 1080p is not going to be an issue whatsoever here on the 5060. Now, I imagine maybe there might be some like really intensive fire effects that might drop us temporarily, but really nothing really to be concerned about. It seems to be a really, really strong performance here at 1080p, no problem. And here, another like boss encounter, still no major issue, I guess it would help if we are counting our FPS, but yeah, as you can see, we're not dropping really whatsoever here. So again, 1080p is not going to be an issue for you whatsoever. Alright, we're sticking with the same settings now, just bumping up to 1440p. So the only thing that we're changing here is our resolution. And as you can see, we're still getting, at least in the round table hold, we're still getting right around 60 FPS. So definitely, still really solid performance here. Seems like pretty much the same as 1080p as far as our performance goes. So we'll see if this holds true as we actually jump into a match. All right, and loading in here, really the performance, you know, the fact that we're getting around 60 FPS, that may not be super surprising. You know, Elden Ring, like I said, it's not a very demanding game, but what may or may not be surprising to some people is just an open world game, the fact that it's using so little video memory. So even at 1440p, and again, these are all the maxed out settings here, we're still getting, you know, just under 5 gigabytes used when it comes to our video memory. So definitely happy to see that. You know, while the game looks gorgeous, in my opinion, I mean, it's a really solid looking game, and a lot of that's due to the actual art style and like the visual direction of the game, as opposed to like any like super, you know, demanding visual effects. But the fact that it does look so good and uses so little video memory, you know, it's definitely a good thing, especially when you only have 8 gigabytes to work with like we do today. So running around here, while we're still getting, you know, essentially 60 FPS, I mean 59 is pretty much where we're really sat at here. Our 1% lows are considerably lower here at 30 with this, I don't know if I'd call it an issue, really just like a quirk that I've noticed when testing the B580. Same issue took place where there's just this like consistent, you know, stutter that's happening. Now it's consistent enough aside from that stutter that I'm honestly not really noticing. And please don't pay attention to the fact that I just died to like a relatively weak mob of enemies here, but in my opinion, you know, I could contribute that potentially to a network issue, so could potentially be the reason that we are seeing that stutter there. But really the way I'm seeing it, it doesn't really look like the stutter is like super noticeable or really impacting my experience personally, but it is there, something to kind of be mindful of. But as you can see, like our GPU utilization is just around like 70%, 75 to 79, kind of fluctuating between there. So certainly indicative that the 5060 is absolutely is having no problem with this game. You know, really 5060 is a really strong card in my opinion. You know, for the money, it's a good card. The issue is just the video memory. So the video memory is going to definitely rear its head in a lot of circumstances, but not in this particular title. You know, when you compare it to like a 5060 Ti, it actually holds up pretty well. The difference with the 5060 Ti is that there's a 16 gigabyte variant. So the 5060 8 gig and the 5060 Ti 8 gig, they perform, from what I can tell and from what I've seen personally, they perform really, really similarly. So my opinion, you know, definitely you're trying to pick between those two cards, go for just the base 5060, but you're probably better off 9 times out of 10, you know, going for a higher gigabyte model. In this game, it's not really going to matter, at least at the resolutions that we've tested so far. But I imagine even once we go up to 4K, just the way things are kind of scaling, I don't think it's going to really be an issue whatsoever. All right, and here we have a dragon here, or we had one. You can see it didn't really drop our FPS, so it's one of the more intensive like enemies that you'll come across with a lot of like fire effects, things like that. So definitely seems like 60 FPS or 59 in reality is certainly on the table here for 1440p. No real issue here. And you know, one last note, our video memory, you can see well under that 8 gigabyte threshold, right around 5 gigabytes or so. So, you know, 8 gigabytes is nice to have, and we would love to have it, of course, but not necessary in this particular game. All right, we're going to keep actually stay in this match for now, since we're kind of, you know, progressing onwards, but sticking with still the maximum setting and now just bumping up to 4K resolution here. And here at 4K is where things, I don't know if I'd say fall apart necessarily, but definitely get, you know, pretty consistently below 60 FPS. Averaging right around 47 running around. Now this is at completely maxed out settings, so shouldn't be a major surprise for the 5060. I will say the B580 seemed to handle this a bit better at max settings. And the only reason I'm drawing that comparison is just because that's the other card that I have benchmarked up until this point. The other thing that's kind of a bummer is that there is no upscaling in this game. Now, to be fair, you don't really need upscaling in like 99% of situations. You know, you're better off just dropping some settings. But, you know, because I know we probably could hit a much more reliable 60 FPS with some settings just, you know, barely notched down, it is a bit of a bummer to see that it's not an option whatsoever. But as you can see right now, we are getting much higher FPS, you know, around the 50s and now touching the 60s at times. And this is completely max settings, so it's definitely not a terrible experience here, even with like all these like more crazy type effects going on, still getting really solid performance. So, you know, while we are getting like 60 FPS pretty like solidly at times, we're dipping down low enough below 60 that I do think it's worth kind of just digging in and changing just some settings. So we are going to go for these same settings that worked for me on the B580 and see if these kind of work as well. Going for the medium preset, and then the only thing I'm going to come in here and change is just turning off motion blur and then bumping up anti-aliasing from low to high for our quality here. And of course I am, you know, waiting for the match to be over to do this to ensure that all these settings actually load correctly. And you can see, at least in the starting area here, we are getting a pretty locked, a tight 60 FPS without any stutters or anything. So I do think those stutters and that frame time graph kind of spiking up and down could probably be, you know, I'm pretty confident in attributing that to just some networking issues. And loading in here, you can see this is kind of our more intensive area, you know, flying in here, and we are getting a much better. Dipping below 60 like just so ever so briefly at times, but in general holding a real solid 60 FPS average here. And moving up the anti-aliasing quality, all that does is just smooth out some rough edges that I did notice even at 4K, maybe a bit surprisingly, but even at 4K, we did notice in previous testing a bit of issues with like faraway structures and things like that. So this does now pretty much eliminate all of that completely. And now you can see here we are getting, you know, 60 FPS pretty consistently here, as well as our video memory. It's just kind of like nearing 6 gigabytes, still well under the 8 gigabytes that we have. So, you know, although the fact that we have 8 gigabytes is not great in a lot of games, doesn't seem to really matter and cause really any problems in this particular title, which is definitely nice to see. And, you know, for my money, medium settings, in my opinion, still looks really great here. I mean, you know, so much of what makes this game look good is more than just like graphic settings. It's just like a really beautifully designed game, you know, and even bumping down some settings doesn't really, you know, take much away from that. So we have a dragon here, so we can go ahead and see if this, you know, more intensive type scene drops our FPS at all. And at least so far, it doesn't seem like really much of anything is hurting that 60. So, you know, our GPU utilization seems to indicate that this will be a consistent 60 FPS experience, and that is what we are actually experiencing here. So definitely nice to see that, you know, modern title here, Elden Ring, definitely a game that you need to have a good FPS in order to play this really at all. Like you'd be at a major disadvantage if you were, you know, fighting with your GPU and its performance in order to actually play the game. So it is definitely nice to see that you can play the game. You can play it effectively. You can play it at 4K even on a 5060. So maybe not super surprising. You know, the game is not super demanding, and it's based on, you know, what is, I believe, like a 5-year-old game at this point. So maybe it isn't as impressive as it might seem on the face of it, but still nice to see in my opinion nonetheless. Alright guys, that's been Elden Ring Nightreign on the RTX 5060. Pretty solid performer, obviously not a super demanding game, and you know, you do have to make some concessions when you move up to 4K, but the concessions that you're making are really not too severe, really not even, you know, I wouldn't even really notice personally like that we were making any sort of concessions. But yeah, definitely a really solid performance. So it just goes to show that, you know, while people do, you know, say negative things about the 5060, and a lot of it is warranted. I'm not trying to say that, you know, it has perfect performance or it's like a perfectly priced or competitive GPU in all circumstances. I do think that for a lot of people, you know, you can still have a really solid experience on the card. All right, guys, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.